Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Eric Small. I'm a senior medical animator for Mad Microbe Studios. Today I'm going to talk about some non-standard rigging techniques. Particularly in this case, we're going to be looking at a monoclonal antibody and methods that we can use to rig this up in preparation for animation, but not using joints and skin objects. So what we're going to look to do is create an object kind of floating around like this. Um, but yeah, like I said, instead of using joints, we're going to use a variety of different techniques. So I'm going to jump over into a clean scene where we just have our antibody here. Clear off the work plane just so we can see this a little bit more readily. The first technique I'm going to show you how to use is just going to be a standard pose morph. So I'm going to right click and add a pose morph, and I'm going to go into point mode. So I've already got a selection here, so I'll just start with this one. And in order to make this thing kind of wiggle and jiggle around, I want to have all of the different arms, the top arms here and the tail, we're going to have them wiggle, wobble back and forth. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my rotate tool, but I'm going to bump the rotational axis point up to the very top. And then I'm also going to enable soft selection. Now I don't want to bend all of this. This is where this is yellow is where this bend will go. So we don't want to quite bend like that. So I'm going to reduce the diameter of the soft selection, and I'm going to check on the surface only. I only want it to affect a pretty small space right here. Pop that down. I might even shrink this selection a bit. And by doing that, I'm just hitting U, and then if you look in the list that pops up, I'm hitting K, just to shrink that selection size a bit. So what I'll do is I will rotate this, and there we go. That's our first pose morph. So I'm going to label this. I'm going to label this tail. Now, one issue though with pose morph out of the box is that it is strictly a linear interpolation. So when a point moves from one location to another, that point is simply going to move in a straight line. So if I move this back, there's no arcing to this motion. It's just a linear movement. And if you compare at 0% to 50%, you actually get a shrinking of the tail right here. But we can get around that. In the mixing mode, instead of using relative, I'm going to drop that down to rotational. And what I want to do is I want to set the points that I'm going to have it rotate around. So I'm going to grab a loop selection, or I'm sorry, I want to get a rectangle selection, and I'm going to deselect everything, and I'm going to grab the points that I want this to actually rotate around. So I'll grab those right there. We'll go down to the bottom of the tag here, and I'm going to set this to rotate from these points right here. Click that button. Now, when we zoom back out a smidge, we've got the strength, and we see this is actually rotating as opposed to moving in a straight linear fashion. So we don't get that awkward deformation right around the 50% strength. We'll go up, and now we're going to do the same for the other two arms. Grab another pose morph. I'll call this one arm 1. And I'll grab a lasso selection, and we'll grab everything here on this arm. I'm going to expand the selection just to make sure I got everything, and that's going to be U, Y. And we're still in our soft selection mode, but once again, the axis is now not in the correct location. I want the axis to be right down here in the pivot point. So switch into rotation, go over to the axis. I'm going to drop it down a bit in the Y, and then I'm going to move it over in the negative Z. And I'm referencing that by looking at the gizmo right up here. That's telling me where I need to actually adjust these values in order to have it rotate in the correct location. So I'm going to take this up. Looks about good there. I already enabled that arm 1, but now we got to switch this to rotational. And I will grab my lasso selection. I'm going to have it rotate around these points right here. Back down from points, and we can check then to make sure this is rotating appropriately. And one more time, I'm going to add one more pose morph. Arm 2. Lasso selection. I missed a couple of points over here, but by doing the UI, see that fills that in perfectly. This might be bending a little too close to the middle, so I'm gonna deselect those. Pardon that. And we need to do the rotation one more time, but this time I'm going to slide it over into the positive Z, down a little bit more, just so it's going to be rotating from the center, and bend that however far we want. Once again, switch it to rotational, and we'll grab the points that we want to rotate it from. So just grab it in the middle. I'm going to go to the pose morph, go to the bottom, and set the points that we want to rotate from. Now here we are. So now if we go back up to the top of our pose morph, go over to animate, now we are all set to set our keyframes and animate. I'm gonna pop open the the dope sheet here, the timeline, and at frame 0, I'm going to record the sliders. And that sets keyframe for all of the different poses that we have. And then I'm going to jump ahead to about frame 48, 2 seconds in, and I'm going to move all these sliders up, record. Now if we rewind, we hit play, it plays through, looks good, but then everything stops. What we can do is if we open up our timeline editor a little bit more here, I'm going to select all 3 of these, and then in the attributes, right now, it's telling it right here after what happens after the keyframes end, and right now it's constant. So these, the values of the slider are going to remain constant at 100%. I want that to actually oscillate, and to show this a little bit better here, let's flip over to the F curve, and you see right now, it just, right here, this black line remains constant. If we change that to oscillate, now it's going to continue going from 0 to 100, back to 0, back up to 100, and it's going to repeat that indefinitely. I'm going to do the same thing for the beginning here as well, and I'll show you why in just a second. I want oscillate and not offset repeat. Now when we play this, everything just continues. Now it's a little synchronous right now for my liking, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift keyframes a little bit and maybe even expand this one out a touch more. And it's still going a little fast. So I'm actually going to bump this out a little bit longer. So now we got our wiggling antibody. And to make that look even a little bit better, we'll go to, I am in the unfamiliar layout here. So I'm going to switch over to more of the traditional conventional standard mode. And actually, as I look at this a little bit closer now, I think this might be deforming a little too much. Beautiful thing about the pose morph tag is that I don't have to go in and actually adjust the keyframe values. I can just adjust the overall strength of the pose morph. If I reduce this down to 0, I can hit play and nothing's going to happen. But if I bump this up to say 50%, it's still moving, but I didn't have to adjust any of the keyframes. So that's an independent strength adjustment that you have that affects the entire pose morph tag, as opposed to just individual pose morphs. So for here, I'm going to put this into a null just for the sake of thoroughness and cleanliness, and rename it MAB for monoclonal antibody. And I'm going to add a vibrate tag to this. So I want this to animate or enable or vibrate in the position and in the rotation. Now this is pretty fast and a little bit much, so I'm going to reduce it to maybe 0.25 frequency. And then likewise with the rotation. I'll keep it at 30, but I'm going to drop that down to 0.25. That might even be still a little too fast. Let's go to 0.1. Now we have a nice floaty antibody with very minimal keyframes and very little, a lot of control with a relatively simple setup. So this is just one way of setting up a molecule to in preparation for animation. And this doesn't apply to just antibodies. This could be any type of molecule, or it could be anything, a cell. It could be even a character in here you could rig with pose morphs. Just one way to rig something and prep it for animation without using the standard joint and skin relationship. I'm going to pause this. I'm going to clear all this out. I'm going to start fresh. I'm going to make sure this is at 0%. Delete off the pose morph tag. Delete off the vibrate. I'm going to set this back to the origin. Fun tip, if you can shift select all of these, and then if you right click on the arrow, it will reset everything to the default value. But if you control right click, everything that is selected will reset itself to the default value. I couldn't believe it when I found that. It made things so much easier and so much faster. Another way that you can rig things up is actually just using deformers. So let me shut off the soft selection for the time being. I'm not going to need that at the moment. And I'm going to add in, let me go back, different layout one more time. I'm going to go in and I'm going to add a bend deformer. Now, by having your object selected, when you create something new and you hold the shift key, that'll automatically make that object or element that you're creating a child of the object that is selected. Can be very handy when you've got a really long list of objects in your object. So I'm going to rotate this. I'm going to shrink it down a little bit more because I'm going to use this bend deformer to control the movement of the one arm, what we called arm one in the previous example. So I'm going to bring this up a little bit, and I just want it to bend right here at this axis. So if we go into our object, I'm going to bend it, and of course it's bending in the wrong axis. Your bend deformer is never oriented correctly the first time. All right, so we'll rotate that around, go a little bit farther. There we go. Bend that up. All right, so we're getting there. I'm going to shrink it down just a little bit like that. And that's starting to work. But we see that it's not just the arm that is being bent. We're getting some deformation up here on the second arm and down here on the tail. To get around that, I'm going to disable the bend for the moment, and I'm going to go up to the lasso selection. I'm going to select this arm, grab the points that I missed, and I will just expand the selection to make sure I've got everything. And what I'm going to do is I'm set this as a vertex map. So I want all of these points here to be 100% vertex weight. Now, if we look in here closely, you see that there is a harsh delineation between where it's 100% affected versus 0%. And to really show that for a moment here, let's plot this vertex map. Let's rename this arm 1. And we're going to use this as a field. So now when we turn this on, you see that that arm gets bent, but the second arm and the tail are no longer being affected. So that's working good. It's about where we want it to be. Now it looks like I may have missed a couple of points, but that's all right. Because what we're going to do is how we have this really harsh delineation right here. I'm going to use the commander to pull up the paint tool. So the commander is Shift C, and now here you can search for any tool, any command, any object within Cinema 4D, and I want the paint tool. Just start typing it in, and now I'm in the paint tool. I'll make sure that it is in smooth mode. I'm going to smooth it 10 iterations per time that I click apply all. And you see how that harsh line just changed to a nice smooth gradient. And now when we start bending this, there's a nice smooth deformation occurring as opposed to that harsh fall off. So we're going to label this arm 1. I'm going to rinse and repeat now. We'll create our bend deformer. I'm going to shrink this down, zoom in, we're going to rotate it, and move it into place, shrink down a little bit more, and then we're going to put this as a child in order so that this can start deforming. And once again, we're in the wrong rotation, so let's rotate that up by 90, and we will now create our second vertex map. So back to our lasso selection, drag around, get all of our points. Gonna grab a couple that I missed right in here, and then we'll once again set ourselves a vertex map. Hit OK. I'm going to jump, because I know that we want to smooth this, I'm going to jump back into the commander. That tool's already still there. Hit apply, apply. We get that nice smooth gradient happening. We'll label this arm 2. Arm 2. And back into our fields, we're going to drop this one in. Now we'll double check everything's working appropriately. One last time. I'm going to deselect everything, deselect that vertex map. I'm going to go back to the lasso selection and get all the points of the tail, set our vertex map at 100, Shift C for the commander, paint tool, smooth all, and we're all set now for the tail. one more bend deformer. This time we know that it's definitely going in the wrong direction. So we'll flip it around 180 degrees, shrink it down, nice and small, get it into position the way we want it, and bring that in as a child of antibody. We'll call that tail. Drag in our vertex map, and then we are set to bend in the wrong direction once again. Can never win that battle. All right, there we go. So now we're ready to start animating. But you've got 3 different bend deformers right here. And that means that you're going to have to go in and keyframe 3 different bend deformers. And not a huge deal, but if you start getting into a complex scene where you've got a lot of elements and a lot of these particular antibodies, that could be a lot of manual keyframe and a lot of clicking through different objects through the hierarchy. So instead of that, I'm going to show you how to use some custom user data to create a small interface that will bring all the bend deformer strength parameters into one single location. And I'm going to do that up here, right in this top null. So it's very accessible. Even if the scene starts to get really built out, it's going to be at the top null, so you're not going to have to dig through a whole long hierarchy. It's super easy to do. You got this menu item right here called user data. And it's a matter of just clicking and adding user data. But I'm not going to use this user data. Reason being is that if I were to set all of this up, hand it off to somebody else, they may not know where that user data is located. They would have to click on every single one because you look here, you've got user data that you can add to every single object. A few iterations ago of Cinema, they added a custom user data tag. I believe it is in programming tags. Yep, user data. Now, with Cinema, they love using tags, and it's brilliant because you can see right along the side here off to the right of the object that, oh, hey, look right here, I've got vertex maps. It's visual, it's not hidden beneath the object or making you have to click on it in order to find it. So adding custom user data by tag will tell somebody that I hand this file off to that, oh, hey, look, there's user data right here. I can see that visually instead of having to actually click on the object. We add then user data the exact same way. So we're going to go add user data. And I'm going to call this arm1, and we're going to use this arm1, and I'm going to switch its interface. This is purely personal preference. You can change it later, but I like the float slider because I can either type in a number or I can just use a slider. And we're going to use this to control the strength of that arm1 bend deformer. And that bend deformer is being done in degrees. So instead of the unit of percentage, I'm going to do a degree. And we don't want to bend that that arm very much because it could start intersecting with the tail or maybe the other arm. You know, let's say we only want to bend it maybe 20 degrees in each direction. So I'm going to set a minimum of 20 and then a maximum or minimum of -20, a maximum of +20. That way it can oscillate up and down, back and forth. By hitting OK, now we've got a slider that does nothing. We can change that, and we're going to use some espresso, but this is going to be the simplest amount of espresso you're ever going to come across. It's a matter of right-clicking, we have expressions, and we're going to set the driver. This is going to drive the strength value of the arm1 bend deformer. Right-click on the strength, expression, set driven. So we're going to use the driver to drive the strength of this bend deformer. Now, when we go back to the user data, this particular slider now is controlling the strength of this particular bend deformer without having to go all the way down the hierarchy to find this one deformer. So let's rinse and repeat. This time I'm going to go to Manage Data, copy and paste. This time we'll call it arm2 and paste one more time. And then this one, drag it down, and this one we'll call tail. Should be all set. We're going to expressions, set driver, tail2, or sorry, arm2, set driven, back up to our user data tag, expressions, set driver, go up to the tail, set driven. If you notice that right here, you see how the diamond changed into the square with a little triangle off to the side? That's telling you that that is being controlled by some espresso and some expression somewhere in the project. If you hover over that, it pops up with the this little menu here that gives you the information where that espresso tag is, just if you ever need to manually make some changes. So once again, we're all set. We're able to bend, we're able to move all of this. We can drop down, let's pull up the timeline, and I will dock that down below so for easy access. I'm going to set our keyframes, and let's set these at frame 0. And I think we found in the previous example that about 72 to 96 was actually a good amount of time before these changed. So clicking, setting keyframes, and I'm going to do just like I did with the pose morph. I'm going to offset these a little bit from one another just so that they doesn't look like it's moving synchronously. And if we then hit play, nothing happens, and that's because we need to do that same trick of setting the keyframes to oscillate. So I'll just grab all of them, oscillate, and I'll do the same thing for the ones beforehand as well. So now it will infinitely just kind of keep flapping away, and we can add another, add our vibrate tag the way that we did previously, turning on our animate or amplitude. One, not 0.1, pardon that. And now we have yet another way of rigging up an antibody or any molecule using just deformers in this case. So that's two ways. So we did pose morph. We're using regular deformers, bend in this case. I want to show one last way of setting up a molecule for animation. And this is going to be a little bit more involved. But we're going to use a classic character animation tool, not joints and skin, but we're going to use a cluster deformer, which is heavily used in facial animation. So I'm going to zero this out again, not set a keyframe. Select my position, my rotation, control right click, back to 0. So we already have our vertex maps, and I'm going to leverage those in order to do the cluster tool. So I want to first create an actual cluster, and that is found under the character menu, down in the cluster. I'm going to make that a child of the antibody. Now I need a handle in order to control this cluster. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a null. It's the world. I'll toggle, my bad. Here we're going to call this arm1, and we'll use this to drive the arm1, as we've been calling this part of the antibody up here, to drive the animation of it. So right there. In the cluster object, we now want to control the points of arm1. So we'll use that vertex map that we created previously. And then we need a handle in order to control it as well. And that's where this null object is going to come into play. Drag that in. And now we can move this guy around. Interesting. Give me a moment here to, there we are. That's what it was. Then to switch the matrix mode over to object. Apologies for that. So now we've got this handle, this null object that we can move around, and it's going to move the cluster of points being driven by the vertex map. It respects moving in position, but also rotation. So what we can do is we can throw a vibrate tag on this, and for the time being, we'll just do it in position. We hit play. Now this cluster object is driving the deformation of this of the arm1. So we'll call this arm1. And so it's a matter of just rinse and repeat for the rest of this. If we do another null, we'll call this arm2, and one more null for tail. We've already got our vertex maps in place, so we can go into character. I'm holding shift down as I do this, and by doing that, it will automatically add that cluster as a child of the antibody. So we'll call this one tail, and arm, try it again. We'll call this tail, down, and arm 2. It really doesn't matter the order. I just like keeping things in order visually. So we'll drag in our points to deform, and we're going to use the arm to null. And if we move that, we've got that moving up into place. And again, with the tail, we'll bring the tail object in, or the tail vertex map, and then the tail controller. And now we have the ability to not move the cluster, but we'll move the tail control null. Now, one little weird oddity you see as I'm moving the tail here, that the arm 2 over here is also moving. And that is remedied by making sure all of these are in object mode. Obviously, that changes the calculation slightly, but by moving the points back into space, we get our cluster objects where it's not overly deformed, and we can add our vibrate tag just by duplicating, hit play, and we're all set. One thing of note, though, I'm going to throw everything into a null object just in the order or interest of cleanliness. You notice that everything is moving synchronously, and each of these vibrate tags, if you look at the seed value, they're all set to 0. By changing that to some random number, to each of them being a different number than one another, then you get this asynchronous vibration moving around. And we can add one more vibrate tag up on top, and maybe this one is just set to rotate, say 15. And now we have a nice organic movement of the antibody, and that 15 may be a little much, so let's drop that even to like 5. And it's not even too noticeable. We'll Now, each of these methods of setting up a molecule or a cell, they all have their pros and their cons. And there is typically no right answer as to how to set them up. It's all going to be a case by case situation. What do you need the molecule to do? What do you need that cell to do? In this case, the antibody. Does it need to bind to a static receptor? Is that receptor animated? Is it bobbing around with some Brownian motion? Does it need to bind to 2 receptors? And then are those receptors also moving independently of one another? So each of these 3 ways of setting up a molecule to animate is going to be which one you choose is going to be dependent on what you need the molecule to. So in my next presentation, I'm going to show different ways of taking each of these setups and then animating them binding, showing all those different options and which way works for which scenario. But thank you for coming by today. Does anybody have any questions? Sure. hmm So the question was if we want to have the antibody rotate more around the central location right here, how would you do that? Which one would you adjust? And you would only adjust um, the topmost null. So here, if we just take this out of the hierarchy for the moment and we go into our object mode, let's just move that null to the center of the antibody, drop that in, and now if we hit play, now we'll be rotating around that central axis. Oh, I see what you're asking. So can we get if the handle of each particular cluster if we're because right now if we were to rotate this arm right here, it's bending it from the origin. You're asking if we can bend it more from the middle. Yes. Let's see if we can figure out a quick way to do that. I think instinctively I would use the parent-child relationship to do that. And then if we drag that in right here, so now we can move it right here and then bend more like, is this what you were after? Okay. Yeah, so you would leverage the parent-child relationship then in order, by moving a null, the parent null into the center of the cluster, and then having the actual handle that's controlling the cluster object beneath that, and then their relationship then would allow for that central rotation.